Oh, hello there. Yes, well, welcome to nearly the weekend. Yes, that'll do me. I like nearly the weekend. Probably as nearly as I like other things. Yes, anyway, today there was that glorious news, wasn't there? The Tate brothers have safely landed in the USA. Hooray! I would imagine that they'll conduct a stout defence of their innocence from there. Perfect metaphors for our times, which one doesn't need to unpack. You can just make your own, can't you? Yes, indeed. I must admit, it's been a long week one way or another, and fairly dull. It's been dull. The whole thing about right-wing media setting a right-wing agenda is that everything simply circles on itself and nothing is ever done, because nothing realistically must ever change other than we must all become poorer for the greater good. Yes. And the latest one, of course, is the inevitable, what exactly is it to be English? And the answer is, well, it doesn't really matter, I think. I've done videos about this in the past. People in the past certainly used to get very het up with the notion that it was to do with skin colour, because it definitely wasn't to do with that, although it was to do with ethnicity, which is kind of related to skin colour and other things. But it definitely wasn't about that. It was more about all of those very tangible attributes that the English have compared to the Scots or the Irish or the Welsh or the Germans or the Turks or anybody else anywhere. And yes, this was probably highlighted by the trigonometry. Hey, good face for radio, guys. Discussing whether or not Rishi Sunak was English. I think Rishi Sunak is probably one of those archetypal sort of bumbling, consistently out of his place public school boys, and just on that basis might well tick. But I can see why they don't like that, because after all, he does look like, well, an Asian maths nerd, doesn't he? However, whether or not there is such a thing indeed as definitively being English, one can only debate, and it is just remains at that shallow level. And of course, Suella Braveman, everyone's favourite culture warrior, because she has nothing else to do in her life other than imagine what it would have been lying there awake at night, imagining what would have been if only she'd been Kemi Badenoch. Still, never mind, Kemi Badenoch would be on the backbenches again soon, won't she? Because I don't think she's English enough, and Suella is now saying that she isn't either, even though she was arguing certain things a while ago. You can read the article for yourself, but it's worthwhile just unpacking it a bit. In my own case, I disagree with Fraser. That's Fraser, who's been interviewed by the trigonometry guys, who, having been let out of the shackles of the Daily Telegraph contract, can now actually have an opinion which is actually valid. Good grief. Ray speaking, the Queen is English and educated in England, yet I am not English. Okay. My parents, members of the Indian diaspora, immigrants, love, right, were born in Kenya and Mauritius. They acquired British citizenship, but they were not and could never be considered English. For Englishness to mean something substantial, it must be rooted in ancestry, heritage, and yes, ethnicity, not just residence or fluency, which I think most people would, broadly speaking, agree with. Okay, but of course then at that point it does get bitty, because will Suella's kids, if they marry white people and have, well, just slightly different coloured kids, will their kids be English? And if you want to argue that they're not, okay then, but supposing they marry white people and their kids, will they be English? At which point it starts to get all kind of Nazi racial hierarchy trees difficult, doesn't it? Yes. There are a lot of people out there that will argue, no, you just can't be. And, some of them indeed do work for trigonometry, or, I don't know, probably the Lotus Eaters. Yes. But realistically, what exactly does it mean? I'm English. Certainly, I have a very English sensibility, I think, in very many ways. And yet, I am quite a radically different person in terms of my cultural baggage compared to Suella or Others, indeed. There was actually, astoundingly, a very good piece from Eric Kaufman, probably a phrase I will never ever say again in my life. It's put up on the Skeptic, Lord Young's Lord Young's Lord Young channel, if you like. Okay, it's Rishi Sunak English, and it's quite a good piece, which basically says, you know what, kind of. There are English, and there are people that sort of are kind of English but aren't actually that English, and then there are people that may or may not be English depending on what the hell you want it to mean, and that's about as far as it can go. But the one thing I really don't want to hear from people is the way that it is about a set of values, because I certainly have a set of values, but I don't ascribe Englishness to them. I have a sensibility about, for example, things like, I think, my sense of humour. Appalling, I know, yes, okay, but I think that marks me out with sort of wordplay and other things as a sort of vaguely English thing. But there are certainly loads and loads and loads of people out there who have much darker skin than me that could say the same thing. It gets to be quite problematic, and there again, there are all of those kind of Anglophile types. Think of Rafe Hadelman-Coo, for example, who probably, again, in a different context to Suella Braveman, but lies awake at night with fantasies that maybe he'd be lighter skinned. Perhaps that's what he's trying to do with those bow ties in terms of offsetting it, because he isn't English, no matter how much he really wants to be. And in fact, I would argue he's probably less English than Rishi Sunak is, just in terms of his general sensibilities. It all gets very, very messy. And of course, the culture warriors really can't deal with this, which is why they end up kind of spluttering around whatever their terminology is. And we had this, I mean, I know I bang on about Matt Goodwin, but I think it's valid. Anyway, this from him yesterday. British MPs have taken down another picture of Nelson. Yeah, you're only allowed to take down two, all right. The greatest naval commander in history. A man who died for his country. And put up a picture of Yvette Cooper, who cannot even control our borders. Now, I know what you're thinking there, okay? No, Nelson didn't put up a picture of Yvette Cooper, but there is a rather lovely picture of Yvette Cooper. Kind of works, isn't it? It's a powerful symbol of all that's wrong with Britain. Yes, indeed, you mustn't take down a picture of Nelson, a bloke who basically lost limbs for the Empire, and replace it by someone else, although it is a lovely piece. One of the things that lots of these people, I think, like Matt, in terms of their grifterdom, is, one, they don't have a sense of history, come on to that in a second, but they have no real sense of aesthetics. They don't get any form of artistic sensibility at all, because their brains aren't wired that well. But that got me thinking about Nelson's Navy, of course, right? Okay, and Nelson's Navy, if you look at the statistics, we know for a fact, out of complement of, say, on the HMS Victory, yes, that one, oh yeah, Trafalgar, 1812, T, tactics, all that stuff. Anyway, leaving that aside, right, roughly speaking, out of complement of about 820 people, about 10 of them were definitely black. It's probably a higher percentage of people that weren't necessarily noted as such, because that was the nature of the Royal Navy in those days. It contained a lot of people from a lot of different places around the world, because they'd kind of sail around. People died of scurvy, people died generically young in those days, and you kind of had to pick them up from wherever it was. So you'd stop off at a handy Caribbean island and pick yourself up some people who, you know, probably spoke English, probably were able to read, and probably were black. And that's where they come from. So certainly on HMS Victory, you probably had somewhere between 2 and 5% of the entire crew's complement who were actually black. But the whole thing about, you know, defending the borders was, well, a spurious notion, because of course these people were defending generic borders of the British Empire, which was everywhere, wasn't it? Yes, it's a bit hard to think of the Atlantic Ocean as your pond and not think, well, that's about a quarter of the surface of the Earth, isn't it, if you include the land masses behind it. But that's the nature of that. You cannot apply modern sensibilities, particularly when you don't understand anything being beautifully artistic, Matt, onto modern ideas. But Matt, of course, does that because that's all part of his culture war. But if he was honest about it in terms of, you know, looking at serious naval commanders, I think he'd come on to Admiral, oh God, I can't think of his name now. He'd come on to Admiral Pierre Lacoste. Now, you won't have heard of Admiral Pierre Lacoste, but he does represent everything that Matt would find beautiful about Royal Navy, or indeed any Navy's tactics. And I'm surprised he wasn't thinking of him, because of course he was the guy that had to resign because of the French sinking the Greenpeace boat in Auckland Harbour, which you may recall killed a few people. Probably the high point of late 20th century French naval tactics. Yes, still, that was one in the eye for the wokists, wasn't it, Matt? Hooray! Or hurrah, as the French would probably say, because after all, they're not English, are they? No. Anyway, I'm sure there will be various people that disagree with me about the nature of Englishness, but if you can't define what it is in a distinct cultural way, then don't go any further, okay? I don't want to hear in my comments, oh, everybody knows what it is. Other than, if you mean English people that are white, then that's great. But then you have to ask yourself about the Irish and the Jews and the rest. Yeah, gets to be problematic. So why don't you just leave it alone? Does it matter? Does it matter that I have an Irish surname and yet I am as basically as English as they come? And at what point, with my distant Irish ancestor, did they stop having Irish sensibilities and have English ones? Answer, you can't say, because that's not the way that the actual world works. Yes. Anyway, do have a glorious start to the weekend, whenever that starts. Today, I've made up that rule.